So it should start streaming now. We'll give it a few more minutes. All right, you guys, I just tweeted the link for the stream. So we are live now. So Daryl, I'll just get going, and as people stream in, just keep it on mute unless they have questions. Trevor, I'm just gonna swing the share over to you, and then you can just drive whether you want to do your camera or your desktop.
Okay.
So let's just go ahead and get started. So thanks everybody for joining. This is the June NorCal Posh user group meeting. Today we have Trevor Sullivan, Microsoft MVP and Azure Guru, PowerShell MVP and Azure Guru, I should say. Looking for presenters still, so if anybody's got any ideas or want to volunteer, please let me know. Next month, we will be hosting a meeting at the San Francisco location, probably July the 16th, so I will update the meetup.com page with the details. So with that, that's pretty much it for this week. There was a few good YouTube channel updates for PowerShell.org. Check those out. Lots of good articles and resources. Trevor, it's actually at the point now where you just can't, list them all. You just visit these 8 sites every day. So anyway, so with that, Trevor, let's go ahead and introduce yourself and go ahead and proceed. So what I will do now, I will hand over.
So I can probably do screen sharing, right?
Yeah, so I set you as present, and then you should, it's like a green icon with an arrow, something like that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll get started screen sharing here in a moment. Hello everybody, my name is Trevor Sullivan. Thanks for the introduction, Eric and Daryl, and thanks for having me on your PowerShell user group in Northern California. As Eric mentioned, I'm a PowerShell MVP, and I work pretty significantly with the Microsoft Azure Public Cloud Platform and automation thereof. So I wanted to take a little bit of time tonight to talk to you guys about getting started with automating the Microsoft Azure Public Cloud using PowerShell. And really just kind of talk about a business case for the cloud. So we'll kind of start out by making a business case for the cloud. We'll kind of jump into getting started with the Azure PowerShell module, just some best practices around any type of automation work that you're doing in Azure. And then we'll kind of look at automating some of the specific infrastructure as a service features or Iaas features, things like Microsoft Azure Blob Storage, cloud services, virtual machines, virtual networks, and things like that. So let me switch over to my screen sharing here, and we'll pull up a few slides. Is that what I want? Yeah. Screen share. Sorry, I don't use Google Hangouts all that often. I kind of like it
No
though.
problem. Okay,
Can you see that introductory slide there?
I do. Yep.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so the topic of tonight's presentation is Azure Platform Automation. I want to start out my presentation, as I do most of them, with just a brief call to action on social media. So you know, if you're not involved in social media today, it's a very great way to get involved, to get your name out there, to ask questions and get support, and you know, even help other people in the community. So you know, if you're really kind of looking to expand your knowledge on any particular topic, you know, a great way to do that is simply to get involved in social media channels. So, you know, you can do simple things like, you know, answering questions on the Microsoft TechNet forums. You know, scroll through the list. You know, don't be a lurker. You know, feel free to put yourself out there, answer questions, ask your own questions. Don't be shy. There's a lot of people, a lot of Microsoft employees out there who are ready and willing to help you. GitHub is another great resource, and the reason that GitHub is particularly interesting in the context of this particular topic is because the Microsoft Azure PowerShell module, as well as the cross-platform CLI tool that works on Mac and Linux systems, in addition to Windows systems to automate Azure functions, those tools are all available on GitHub. And so Microsoft is actually developing actively on the GitHub project page. You can use the GitHub issue tracker and pull request system to either raise questions or raise bugs or raise any type of feature enhancements that you might want to see in those projects. So as we talk about the Azure PowerShell module, GitHub is a very important social media tool. You can do other things like developing your own YouTube videos. My YouTube channel is PC Geek 86, and I just in the past week and a half I published a new 6-video series on PowerShell version 5 classes. So go out to YouTube, check out my channel PC Geek 86, and you know, check out those YouTube videos that talk about classes and desired state configuration on Azure and other related topics. The Stack Exchange network is great. Most developers are accustomed to using the Stack Overflow network to raise questions and answer people's questions and vote up and vote down questions and answers. So it's a really cool self-moderating community. In fact, the Stack Exchange network as a whole is really the most innovative social channel that I've ever seen in terms of Q&A, because it's really self-moderating. And then finally, and probably most importantly, is Twitter. Twitter is a very fast-paced and sometimes challenging to use channel just due to the amount of information that's flowing across of it, and sometimes some challenges with filtering that information to stuff that's relevant. But you know, Twitter is a great place to just publish nuggets of information. You can post pictures, post videos, post links to articles, post little nuggets of information that you want to share with people. And it's a really great way to just, hey, if you have a really quick tip and you want to share that with the world, you know, hop out on Twitter, add some hashtags to your tweet to target specific topics like PowerShell or PSDSC for desired state configuration, or the Azure hashtag. Just really take advantage of that Twitter channel to get your name out there and start talking about technology. So feel free to reach out to me at trevorsullivan.net or trevor@trevorsullivan.net, and visit my website at trevorsullivan.net. So I'm going to run through these slides pretty quickly, and we're just going to start by talking about why should we use the Azure platform. The first element of the cloud that we really want to focus on is elasticity. And elasticity refers to the ability to scale up and scale down your cloud resources. So as your application demands higher levels of performance, you can scale up that resource, and then when your application has lower demands, perhaps overnight, you can scale those applications back down and lower your costs of IT operations. Next is the element of flexibility, and the element of flexibility really just means that we can rapidly provision as much resources as we need, or as many resources as we need, on the Microsoft Azure public cloud. The Azure Public Cloud is very low cost to do things like storing data, running virtual machines, creating databases. There's a whole bunch of services in the Microsoft Azure platform's portfolio, and many of these services cost as little as pennies per hour to run. So very, very low cost to get started. And then finally, there's no startup or shutdown costs for the Microsoft Azure platform. So you can sign up for a subscription, just like with Amazon Web Services. You can create an account, and until you actually provision resources in that subscription, you don't have to pay for anything. Also, if you're finished using your Azure subscription, there's no shutdown fee. There's no termination fee like old cell phone provider plans where they charge you $200 to terminate your contract. There is no contractual period in pay-as-you-go plans. So what is the business case for the Microsoft Azure Public Cloud? Well, you have to ask yourself, well, where, as a business, where's my revenue source coming from? Am I an office supply company? Am I a manufacturing company? Do I manufacture cars? Do I develop software? What is my revenue model? And if your revenue model doesn't come from actually selling infrastructure, you really have a hard sell to actually build up your own data centers and all the costs that go along with that. The next thing you have to kind of think about is the IT department at my company providing business value. So it's very important that the IT department be able to rapidly respond to demands from the business in order to accommodate new revenue streams. If IT cannot respond to the business in a timely manner and provide the resources that they need to run their applications, then you're going to get what's called shadow IT, where the business basically ignores IT and says, you know what, we're going to go out and actually purchase our own applications. We're going to purchase our own hardware. We're basically just going to set up our own IT department that's specific to our business group. And since we don't want that to happen, we really have to make sure that the IT department is equipped to provide business value. The next question is, do you need to purchase hardware? Is your hardware getting out of date in your data center? Are you running servers that are 5 or 6 years old and they're due for a hardware replacement? If the answer is yes, you've got old servers, stop before you purchase new servers. It's a very costly investment to purchase new servers, to rack them, to configure them, to run cables to them. Very, very large amounts of costs in migrating from hardware to hardware. So if your answer is yes, I need to purchase hardware, yes, my hardware's out of date, then you really might want to consider looking at the Microsoft Azure Public Cloud to provision new virtual machines and other types of resources. You also have to consider your data center costs. So there's real estate costs, there's infrastructure costs, there's temperature control, air conditioning, electrical, water, fire suppression, physical security, compliance, audits, cabling, monitoring, backup generators. I mean, there's massive, massive amounts of cost that goes into building data centers. And again, unless your business model actually revolves around that, like Microsoft's or Amazon's or Rackspace Clouds or Google Clouds, if you're not actually selling that infrastructure as a business model, then you really have to ask yourself, what is the value to the business of actually running a data center? And then the final point here is, do I have a disaster recovery plan? If you haven't tested your disaster recovery plan and you haven't really evaluated the costs of your disaster recovery plan, you may want to consider using Azure as a disaster recovery platform. So Microsoft Azure offers a feature called Azure Site Recovery that actually enables you to use Azure as a DR site for your Hyper-V and VMware ESX VM clusters. So now that we've talked a little bit about a business justification to use the Microsoft Azure Public Cloud, let's talk about some of the tasks that we might want to accomplish in the cloud using automation. So if you put on your developer hat and you want to leverage the cloud, you might think, well, where do I start? Well, there's a lot of platform as a service offerings in the Azure cloud that don't involve managing the underlying infrastructure. So as a developer, if all you want to do is host a web application and support the application with a SQL Server database on the back end, you can simply deploy the web application without having to deploy it to a virtual machine. There's platform services that allow you to actually just host a website without any of the underlying management. You can also simply create SQL databases in the Microsoft Azure cloud, and again, you don't have to worry about managing the underlying operating system, the configuration, the security. All of that is handled for you by the Azure cloud. You can also use external source control systems like Visual Studio Online or Bitbucket or GitHub to allow you to push changes very rapidly to your website so that your QA team can test the application, and then once that application's been tested, you can rapidly deploy it to a production environment. If you have needs for high availability, there's also the ability to create load balancers in the Microsoft Azure cloud, and you can create multiple instances of your application and then use load balancing to spread the load across those instances. If you're an IT pro coming from an infrastructure background, you might also wonder, well, how do I get started with the cloud, and what types of things might I want to achieve by using the cloud? Well, if you're an IT pro, you've probably got a lot of servers, and those servers are probably sitting in racks in your data center somewhere, and you want to be able to move those services up to the cloud because those servers are getting old. So you can spin up virtual machines in the Microsoft Azure cloud very easily in a matter of minutes. You can deploy those virtual machines into a virtual network, and you can manage the virtual network by using firewall rules to prevent communications between critical business virtual machines. The blob storage service is what enables you to run virtual machines, and it actually stores the VHD files that the virtual machines run off of. There's also other value-added features in the Azure cloud, such as Azure Remote App, which enables IT administrators to publish applications through terminal services without having to manage the underlying virtual machine's configuration. So as you adopt the cloud, there's several different usage models that you should be aware of. The most heavy model but flexible model is infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. So IaaS allows you to basically host virtual machines, host hardware in the cloud, and you can deploy those machines into a virtual network and basically manage them like you would an on-premises infrastructure. In the PaaS, or Platform as a Service model, as a developer, you would deploy features such as SQL Server databases, such as DNS-based load balancings, content delivery networks, caching services, websites, and other types of platform services that abstract away the underlying infrastructure that is required in the IaaS model. And then on the far right, there's the SaaS model, or Software as a Service model, which basically means that you are providing an application that that your end customers can actually simply sign up for and start using immediately. So good examples of SaaS applications are things like QuickBooks Online, or Gmail, or Hotmail, or Outlook.com, and things like that. So now that we've talked a little bit about the Azure platform, let's actually talk about how we interface with it from an automation perspective. So the Azure platform is exposed through two different APIs, the traditional Service Management API and the Azure Resource Manager API, or ARM. Each of those APIs those REST APIs has .NET libraries that wrap the functionality inside of them. And then there's a PowerShell module. In fact, there's two different PowerShell modules that allow you to interface with Azure using the Service Management or Azure Resource Manager APIs. And the PowerShell module sits on top of the .NET libraries that are used by C# developers to code directly against Azure. So just to compare and contrast the two APIs a little bit, the Azure Service Management API is the kind of older, existing, full-featured API that's XML-driven. It's a REST API that contains imperative APIs, which basically means that every single call you make performs a single action. So you might create a virtual machine, you might delete a virtual machine, you might create storage blobs, you might delete storage blobs. So all of those are what are called imperative APIs. On the Azure Resource Manager side, it's essentially a new API that allows you to use a declarative JSON syntax to declare your cloud resources. If you're familiar with PowerShell desired state configuration, Azure Resource Manager is essentially like PowerShell DSC in the sense that it's declarative. However, Azure Resource Manager is used to declare cloud resources, whereas PowerShell DSC is used to declare resources to manage the operating system. So Azure Resource Manager, in addition to the declarative API, also offers imperative APIs, very similar to the Azure Service Management REST API. One of the really unique features about Azure Resource Manager is the ability to segment resources inside of your Azure subscription or your account via resource groups. Now, each group can be built to different business units inside of your organization separately. So if you have one part of your organization that's using very large virtual machines, very costly cloud resources, you can actually keep track of the expenditure of that particular business unit by declaring a resource group for them. Another cool feature is the ability to add tags, which isn't mentioned in the slide, but you can actually tag your resources, which are basically just pieces of metadata, and each resource can have up to 15 tags on them. So for example, each resource might have a business unit tag that determines which business unit inside of the organization a particular resource belongs to. So this is just a very high-level overview of what the Azure Resource Manager structure looks like. At the very top level, you have your Azure subscription or account, and then underneath of that, you can have multiple resource groups. Each of the resource groups contains individual resources, such as virtual machines, SQL databases, websites, content delivery networks, storage accounts, and things like that. One of the other unique features about the Azure Resource Manager is that you can actually use role-based access control, or RBAC, to secure access to the individual resources. So back in the old service management interface, you had to basically give somebody, if you wanted to give somebody access to your cloud subscription, you had to give them full access to all the resources inside your subscription. So one of the problems that ARM solves is having the ability to designate the permissions that a particular user has for particular cloud resources. And again, we already talked about the ability to add tags, which are just the pieces of metadata that can be declared either at the resource group level or at the resource level. So as we dive into automation from the Azure PowerShell module, there's a few best practices that I would like you to keep in mind as you continue your development work. So the first and foremost point here is to keep the Azure PowerShell module up to date on your system. So Microsoft is releasing new versions of the Azure PowerShell module every 2 to 3 weeks, and sometimes even more frequently than that. There's a couple of different types of authentication that can be used against Azure, and if you're already using Azure today, you might be familiar with a concept called the publish settings file. So the publish settings file is essentially a metadata file that contains information about your Azure subscription, and it also contains a management certificate that is used to authenticate against the API. However, going forward, the Azure Resource Manager API will only support Azure Active Directory authentication, so as a best practice, I recommend that you use Azure AD instead of management certificate authentication. And then another best practice here is to use PowerShell splatting. So splatting is a technique in PowerShell that allows you to basically take multiple parameters on a PowerShell command and declare those parameters inside of a hash table, and then you can actually pass in that hash table of parameters into the command. And the benefits of doing this is that it makes your code a lot more readable, and it also separates the variables of your script from the actual logic of your script. So let me just switch over really quickly and show an example of using PowerShell splatting. Actually, there's a couple of things I want to demo here. So Eric, let me know if I need to share ISC here.
Okay.
Let me know if that shows up.
It's showing up. You might want to scooch the phone up a little bit.
Okay.
That should be good.
Cool. So just a really quick example of PowerShell splatting. So let's say that we wanted to call the set content command to just create a file. Well, you might create a command called set content specify a path to a file like c/demo/norcal/test.txt. And then you might pass in a value to the file, like this is a very. So as you can see, sometimes we can get very long PowerShell commands. So in this case, we only have a couple parameters. But if you had a PowerShell command that had 5 or 6 or maybe 10 different parameters, which some of them do, these commands can become very lengthy. So what split allows us to do is inside of a hash table. So we have parameters and values and put those into a hash table. Once you've built that hash table of parameters, you can then splat those parameters onto the command by using the @ sign and then the name of the variable that contains the parameters you want to pass into the command. So if we were to run that command and then go call get content, c demo norcal test, you can see that we achieved the same result as calling the command directly. So again, this is just a way to separate the variables or your input parameters from your actual code logic. So that's splatting. The other thing I want to show is where the Azure PowerShell module is located. So let me switch over to a browser here. Come on. Share. Where is Internet Explorer? Can we see that? Cool. I think that's showing up here if it's not. So if we go out to github.com/azure/azure-PowerShell, this is the location of where the project is hosted. So if you're brand new to the Azure PowerShell module, what you're going to want to do is go out to this GitHub project page, go down to the releases section, and there's a link for the Windows standalone installer. Now all of the release history is shown here. So if we scroll down in this page, you'll see that 12 days ago, version 0.9.2 was released. Back on May 4th, 0.9.1 was released. Back on April 29th, about less than a week before that, 0.9.0 was released. And so as you can tell, there's very, very frequent releases of the Azure PowerShell module. And you want to make sure that you regularly come out to this page and you check to see if there is a new version available. There's always new functionality that's being released. There's always bugs that are being fixed, as you can see here. And so you just want to make sure that you're grabbing the latest module. Now, another thing you can do, if you do have any problems with the PowerShell module, you can come over to the Issues tab here, and you can simply report a new issue. Got my password here. Okay, so here I can add a new issue to the GitHub project page. So that's where we get our module from. And then finally, on the Azure Active Directory authentication part, I wanted to point out to you where you actually set that up. So once you have your Azure subscription, you're going to want to scroll down to the Azure Active Directory icon here. And then what you'll do is you'll go into your directory and you'll create a new user account. Now you can call the user account whatever you want, such as automation@trevorsullivan.net. That's already in use. And then you need to just give it a name, so we'll just call it PowerShell Power. And then the role can actually just simply be a standard user. And then what you'll do is you'll create the user account, and it will provide you a temporary password. You'll take that temporary password, and then you'll go out to an in-private browsing session. Can you see that? No, I don't think you can. There we go. So you go out to an in-private browsing session, and then you go to the myapps.microsoft page, and then you'll type the username, and then try to log in. You'll put in that temporary password, and then when you try to log in, it'll actually ask you to update the password to something different. So as you can see, it says, please update your password. So we'll go ahead and update that password. And once you've done that, the account is now a valid user account in Azure Active Directory. So we can go ahead and close that Internet Explorer page, and then we can come back out to our Azure Active Directory, or our Azure Management Portal. You go down to the Settings tab, go over to Administrators, and then you'll click Add and specify the user account that we created. You'll check off the Azure platform subscriptions that you want that user account to have access to, and then click the check mark, and it will then create it as a co-administrator of your Azure subscriptions. So as you can see, I've now added my Automation 2 account as an administrator of my subscription, and so I can then go over to PowerShell. Let me change over to that here. So we're going to switch back to our PowerShell ISE, and we've already installed the Azure PowerShell module at this point. But what we can do is we can call a command called add Azure account, and if we just hit F5 to run that add Azure account command, we'll then type in that credential. And that will authenticate us to the Microsoft Azure platform. So as you can see, we get an object back when we call add Azure account.
Hey, Trevor, I'm not seeing your screen.
What's that?
Not seeing your screen.
The PowerShell ISE?
Yeah.
Pizza if you want pizza. I don't blame you.
It's not showing up for you at all. Let me try it again.
I can see you now. Okay, there you go. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So after we call the add Azure account command, we get back an object that shows us the authentication of that user. So it shows us the ID of that user, tells us that it's a user account, duh. And it also tells us that we have access to 2 different Azure platform subscriptions. And then finally, on the far right here, it actually tells us the GUID that uniquely identifies the Azure Active Directory tenant that this user account belongs to. So now that we're authenticated to the Microsoft Azure platform, we can then begin running commands against the Azure subscriptions. However, because we have access to 2 different subscriptions here, we need to make sure that we tell the Azure platform which subscription we specifically want to operate against. Now, there's a variety of different commands that pertain to subscription management, and the way that we can find those is by calling the PowerShell core command called get command. We can specify that we want to grab commands from the Azure module, and we only want to grab command names that contain the text subscription. So as you can see here, there's a few different aliases to commands that stand for the Windows Azure pack, but in this case we don't care about these. So we'll just focus on the 4 commands at the bottom. So the first command is called get Azure subscription. To do is see a list of subscriptions that we are enabled to use. So as you can see, these are the 2 subscriptions that were showing up earlier, the 1C9FD9 and the CB8B24B7. So these 2 subscriptions my account has access to. So once we determine the list of subscriptions that are available to us, we now have to select the subscription that we want to operate on. So to do that, we call the select Azure command, and then we specify the subscription name that we want to operate against. So in this case, if we switch back over to the output here, I'm going to go ahead and actually go to the Visual Studio Ultimate with MSDN subscription. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that name and paste that in there. And if I hit F8 to just run that one line, that subscription is now selected, meaning that any commands that I run in the Azure PowerShell module are going to operate against that account. So now that I've selected that subscription, I can begin running commands to provision resources or view the existing resources that are in the subscription. So I could run a command like get Azure to view a list of Azure storage accounts that are in the subscription. So as you can see, I get back a series of objects that represent all the different storage accounts in that subscription. And I can also create new storage accounts in there as well. Now, if I want to get a comprehensive list of commands in the Azure PowerShell module, I'll go ahead and just call get command and then specify the Azure module. As you can see, there's quite a lot of different commands in here. So generally, you're going to want to filter that down by the feature that you're looking for. If you're looking for storage-related commands, you might use the storage keyword to filter on. So we can do things like create storage accounts, create storage shares, which is basically an SMB share up in the cloud that we can then attach to our virtual machines. We can create blob storage containers. We can create storage queues, which is more of a developer feature. There's a lot of different things that we can do just inside of Azure Storage. Excuse me for one moment while I take care of the dog. Sorry, dog was just being a bit noisy there. So there's a lot of different functions that we can use in Azure here, and if we want to do things that are like virtual machine related, we can also filter down using the VM keyword. So we can do things like start and stop virtual machines. We can create new virtual machines. We can configure what are called virtual machine extensions. And we're actually going to show an example in a little bit here about the desired state configuration extension that allows us to deploy a DSC configuration document out to a virtual machine. So let's see. Let me switch back to my slide here. Cool. So to get set up with the Azure Cloud Platform, you first need to sign up for a subscription, and you can do that simply using a credit card. If you have an MSDN account, you can also take advantage of some MSDN credits that are provided to you. If you have, depending on the level of the MSDN subscription that you have, you get different amounts of credits. So for example, if you have an MSDN Ultimate account, you actually get $150 of credit every month for the Microsoft Azure Cloud. So that would be the best way to take advantage of the cloud, but if you don't have the MSDN account available to you, you can simply pay as you go using a credit card subscription. Once you've established that account, you're going to want to download the Azure PowerShell module and install it, and then authenticate to it, and then select your subscription. And we've already covered all those topics in the examples. So now let's dive into automation of a few different Azure features that are infrastructure related. So as far as managing Azure storage, the top level element in the Microsoft Azure Cloud is called a storage account. If you want to interact with a storage account, you need to get what's called an Azure storage key and then create what's called a storage context that allows you to authenticate against the storage account. Now there's a few different features that are supported in the Microsoft Azure Storage platform. There's Azure Files, which allows you to create an SMB share in the cloud. There's blob storage, which is where you can store arbitrary blobs of data. And blob storage also is the service that backs virtual machines. So we briefly touched on this before, but blob storage is where the VHD files sit for all your Azure virtual machines, and they actually communicate directly with that blob service. There's also a NoSQL service called table storage in Azure, and there's also a developer message queuing service in there as well. The Azure SQL database feature is a pretty straightforward method of deploying deploying SQL databases on the Microsoft Azure cloud. So all you do in a PowerShell perspective is to instantiate a SQL server, and it's important to note that the SQL server itself is not managed by you. So it's basically just a server that's managed by Azure that's deployed into the cloud. So you never actually have to RDP into that server, you don't have to patch it. It's literally just a server that's managed by Microsoft. Once you have that SQL server provisioned, you can then begin provisioning SQL databases on top of it. There's also the ability to configure firewall rules to prevent unknown IP addresses from connecting to your SQL database instance. Virtual networks is another kind of fundamental building block of the Azure public cloud, and the top level node is called a virtual network. Now each virtual network is generally declared as a very large IP space, generally something like a /8 or a /16, and that virtual network is then carved up into subnets. And you can carve up those subnets however you want. You can declare a purpose for each subnet however you want, but oftentimes you'll see architectures that have web servers in one subnet, or database servers in another subnet, or administrative servers in another subnet. And virtual networks also have what are called DNS pointers. So in Azure, there is actually an upcoming DNS service that's still in the preview phase, but in the context of the virtual network feature, what we do is we configure these DNS pointers. And every time that we deploy a virtual machine into this virtual network, those DNS pointers are automatically configured on the virtual machine using a DHCP-like process. So basically those DNS pointers just say, hey, any VM that comes up in this network, you're going to point to these DNS servers. So there's a few different commands that you should be aware of with managing virtual networks. In the old Service Management API, the XML-driven API, there's 3 different PowerShell commands available to manage virtual networks. Now it's a little bit bizarre because the virtual network feature in your subscription is actually just an XML document. It's a single XML document that contains all of the virtual networks inside of your Azure subscription. So there's no way to perform individual actions on each virtual network without actually manipulating the entire XML document that defines all your virtual networks. So when you call the get Azure VNet config command or the set Azure VNet config command, you're actually affecting the entire virtual networking feature for that subscription. There's also the concept of a virtual network gateway, and the gateway is a little bit unique because it does have its own special commands. And the gateway itself that you actually get billed for in your Azure subscription is not part of the XML document that declares the virtual networks. So if you do leverage a gateway, you need to first configure all of your virtual networks and your on-premises networks as well. They're also known as local network sites. And then once you've declared all of that networking configuration in that XML document, you can then begin to provision virtual networking gateways inside of those virtual networks. Network security groups are a really cool feature that allow you to establish firewall rules between virtual machines or virtual network subnets. So a network security group is created just like every other resource in Azure in a particular region. So you would create a network security group, for example, in West US, and that network security group would have to exist in the same region as the virtual network or virtual machines that it's being applied to. Each network security group is made up of a series of different rules, and those network security groups, once those are defined, they can be applied either to a virtual network subnet or to individual virtual machines. Each virtual machine and each virtual network subnet can only have one network security group associated with it at a time. So as far as Azure virtual machines go, in the old Service Management API, virtual machines had to be wrapped inside of a container called the cloud service. Now the cloud service is the entity in Azure that exposes Azure virtual machines to the outside world. Each cloud service in Azure has a publicly routable IPv4 address, and it also has a globally unique DNS name, such as mountdoom.cloudapp.net. So whatever the name of your cloud service is, that's going to be suffixed by cloudapp.net. So in my example code that I'm going to show you in a few minutes, my cloud service is called Mount Doom from Lord of the Rings. There's a few different VM-related commands, such as new Azure VM config and new Azure VM, that are used to actually instantiate the virtual machines inside the cloud service. There's also an image gallery in Azure that allows you to deploy virtual machines from pre-configured images, such as SQL Server images or plain old vanilla Windows Server operating systems. There's also Linux images for things like OpenSUSE or CentOS and other Linux distributions. In the Azure Resource Manager API, a lot of the commands are very similar. However, virtual machines are no longer required to be contained inside of a cloud service container. You have to configure an operating system disk using the set Azure VM OS disk command, and you also have to add a network interface to the VM in order to associate it with a virtual network. So there's a few more configuration steps that you have to go through in the ARM API, but it's very nice because everything is componentized and there is no longer a dependency on a cloud service container. If you need services like load balancing, you can actually instantiate a load balancer as a standalone entity. So here's some of the different commands that you'll want to be familiar with from the Azure PowerShell module and the ARM PowerShell module for creating virtual machines. The Azure platform also provides a series of what are called virtual machine extensions that allow you to apply different configurations to your Azure VMs. So one of those extensions is called the VM Access extension. If you forget the administrative login to one of your Azure virtual machines, you can apply what's called the VM Access extension to that VM, and what happens is the guest agent, the Azure VM guest agent, that's running inside that virtual machine will actually reset the username and password to log into that VM for you. So the way that we do that from PowerShell is we call the get Azure VM command to retrieve the configuration of the VM. Then we call set Azure VM Access extension to configure the extension. And then to commit the change back to the VM, we call update Azure VM. So that will effectively reset our administrative login, and we can then RDP or SSH or use PowerShell remoting to that VM. There is also a PowerShell desired state configuration extension, and the way that this works is you call a command called publish Azure VM DSC configuration, and that'll take your DSC config and actually zip it up along with all the dependent modules, and it will zip it up and put it inside of an Azure Blob container. Then on the VM itself, you call the set Azure VM DSC extension command, and the virtual machine guest agent will then download the blob containing the DSC config from your blob storage container, and it will then process that configuration and apply it locally. The Microsoft Azure platform also provides an automation feature that allows you to deploy SMA runbooks or service management automation runbooks up into the cloud directly. So from the Azure PowerShell module, you can actually create your runbooks. So you can batch import your runbooks. You can create what are called assets, which are like variables that can drive your runbooks. So there's schedule assets, there's credential assets, there's variable assets. There's several different types of assets that you can use to drive your runbooks. And then there's also runbook jobs. So when you actually deploy a runbook, it gets deployed to a runbook worker. The runbook worker does not live inside of your automation account. However, the runbook worker, as it executes your workflow, it will return a runbook job object that allows you to see the state of the runbook on that runbook worker. There's also a new capability in the Azure Automation feature that allows you to essentially deploy a DSC pull server directly in the cloud without having to actually manage the virtual machine to host it. So those are all the slides that I have for the presentation, and so the call to action here after this presentation is, if you're new to Azure, make sure that you go out and sign up for a subscription. Again, if you have the MSDN credits, take advantage of that. There's a special link that you can use in your MSDN account on the MSDN homepage to sign up for that. If you don't have MSDN, you can simply sign up using your credit card. Once you've signed up for your Azure account, you want to go out and download and install the Azure PowerShell module and make sure that you keep that up to date on a regular basis as you continue automating. If you do run into any bugs or you have any feedback or usability feedback, make sure that you go out onto the GitHub project page and file that with the product team. And then from a social media perspective, get involved on Twitter. Use the hashtags PowerShell, Azure, and PSDSC to talk about these different topics and raise awareness of the platform. So with that, I'm going to switch over to a quick demo on how we can use PowerShell to build up a virtual machine and deploy a DSC configuration to it. So let me see here. Screen share, ISE. Can you see that, Eric? Anybody?
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome. So just to kind of step you through the different commands that we're going to use here, the first thing we need to do is authenticate to the Microsoft Azure platform. And we already took a look at how to do that using an Azure Active Directory account that we created. Once we've authenticated to the platform, we then need to make sure we're operating on the correct subscription. Once we're operating on the right subscription, we can then start building out our cloud resources. So to build out virtual machines, the first kind of dependency that we need is called a storage account. So inside of a storage account, we can create what are called blob containers, which is a single level of essentially folders, is the way you could think of them. And those blob containers are going to contain the blobs that actually are our VHD files for our VMs. So if I drill into this Mount Doom storage account and drill into the container called NorCalPosh, you'll actually see that I've got a VHD file in there, and I actually have a VM that's running off that VHD blob. So we can create the storage account and by specifying the new Azure Storage Account command, and then these parameters here are what we're going to pass into that command using the splatting technique. So we're going to give the storage account a name, and storage accounts are globally unique. So once you take a storage account name, nobody else can use that same name because it's a publicly accessible endpoint. You also have to create all of your Azure resources inside of a particular region. So in this case, we're going to create the storage account in the North Europe region. Once we create the storage account, we have to get that, if you recall from the slides, there's what's called a storage context. And the storage context basically is what enables us to authenticate against the storage account from other services. We also have to call the set Azure subscription command, and then we have to basically tell it that on our subscription, the Visual Studio Ultimate with MSDN subscription, we're going to basically change contexts into the storage account that we just created. So we're saying that any virtual machines that we create in this subscription are going to go inside of this storage account. We can then use the new Azure Storage Container command to create a blob container called NorCal-Posh, which is what we're currently in. And this, sorry, I don't think you can see IE, which you can see in the portal. Once we've created the storage account and the blob container inside of it, they're still empty, so we need to actually create a virtual machine and deploy it inside of it. So as we mentioned in the Service Management API, we have to create a cloud service container which provides load balancing and the public IPv4 routable endpoint. And so the cloud service is simply a container with a name that gets deployed into a particular region. So to create a cloud service, we just use the new Azure Service command. We then need to do a bunch of different commands that allow us to what virtual machine image we're going to deploy from using the image gallery. And there's a command called get Azure VM image that allows us to list out all the images available inside of that gallery. And then we'll use the built-in out grid view command to select the image from a nice little PowerShell GUI. From there, we'll use the new Azure config to instantiate the initial virtual machine configuration. Now, when you call the new Azure VM config command, you're not actually creating a virtual machine. What you're doing is you're creating a configuration for a virtual machine that will be deployed in the future. So as you can see, we have to give the virtual machine a name, a size, and if you don't know what size virtual machine to get, you can call a command called get Azure. Type that into out grid view, we can look at the results of that. So these are all the different size virtual machines that are available to you in the cloud. And you can filter or sort by number of cores, filter and sort by the amount of memory, the number of data disks or additional disks that you can attach to the VM. So there's a bunch of different properties that describe each of the virtual machine sizes. So in this case, I'm just going to use the small VM size, which is a single core, and 1.8 gigs of RAM. I'm also going to grab an image here, so let me go ahead and run this command as an example. So it's going to go out and grab all the image metadata. And as you can see, there's lots and lots and lots of different images available that we can deploy from. There's Ubuntu images, there's SQL Server images, Visual Studio images. If you have an MSDN account, you even have access to client operating system images, so for things like Windows 10 or Windows 8.1. There's pre-configured Microsoft Dynamics images, so a lot of different options here. You can also upload your own custom images to the gallery as well, and those show up under a category called user images. So in this case, I'm just going to filter for 2012-R2. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of remote desktop session host images, but I don't really care about those. All I want is just a vanilla Windows Server 2012 virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the most up-to-date version, which is published on May 1st. And that is going to be the image I use to deploy the virtual machine.
Trevor, we can't see the screen here. There you go. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I wasn't showing the out grid view. My bad. So once you create the initial virtual machine configuration, then you'll need to add what's called a provisioning config. And this is a requirement because you have to tell it if it's a Windows or Linux virtual machine. So if we were to look at the help for this command, there's actually two different, or maybe three different parameter sets. And one parameter set's for Windows, and there's another parameter set that allows you to specify a Linux virtual machine. So basically, we just set what the administrative username is. So that's going to be the account we log in as. And then there's a password. So that's the provisioning config. And then ultimately, that's all we really have to specify. However, as we talked about in the slides, there's also the ability to specify virtual machine extensions. So in this case, I'm actually going to configure the PowerShell desired state configuration extension on this virtual machine. So I've already, in a separate file, declared a DSC configuration that allows me to set the time zone of the target virtual machine. I also have a configuration data file that contains a list of my virtual machines. In this case, I only have one, but I could copy and paste this and build out additional virtual machine configurations. So these are my configuration data variables that will then get fed into the DSC configuration. So as we talked about in the slides, the process for using the DSC extension for Azure VMs is that we first have to publish our DSC configuration up to blob storage. So the way that we do that is we provide the storage context, which is that authentication object that allows us to authenticate to our storage account. We also need to specify the blob container name, which we defined up on line 24 here. So that's the container name. And then we also have to specify the path, the local file system path to our DSC configuration. So in this case, the configuration path is the same folder as the script that we're running here, and the file name is dscconfiguration.ps1. So once we've configured those parameters, we then call publish Azure VM DSC configuration, and that will push the configuration up to blob storage. Once that zip file is up in blob storage, we can then configure the extension on the virtual machine configuration object that we still have in memory. So there's a few different parameters here. We first need to tell it what the name of the configuration is. So if we go over to our configuration file here, we can see that the name of the configuration is NorCalPosh. So that's the value that we would specify for configuration name. We can also optionally specify a configuration data path. And the configuration data is the PSD1 file, or the manifest file, that contains all the variables that will get fed into our DSC configuration. The reference name is just a name that you can use to reference the extension in the future. So if you grab that virtual machine out of the cloud and you need to reference the DSC configuration, this is just a friendly name to do that. We also need to specify the storage context and the container name where that blob resides. So that zip file that we published up on line 65 here, we have to tell it the storage context, the blob container name, and we also have to tell it what the name of the archive file is. Now the name of the archive file is simply going to be the name of the DSC script plus the zip extension on the end. And then we also have to pass in the VM configuration that we've been working on. So each time we run one of these commands, we're actually editing this VM config. So we're basically saying, I want you to add the DSC extension to this VM config that I'm building in memory. And then we pass all those parameters into the set Azure VM DSC extension command, and that will ultimately configure the DSC extension on that VM. So at this point, we still haven't actually created the virtual machine. We've simply been declaring the configuration for it without actually creating it. So finally, once we've got everything set up on that VM, we then would call the new Azure VM command, and then we would tell it the cloud service name that we want to put the VM inside of, and then in the VM's parameter, that contains the VM configuration objects that we actually want to use to instantiate the virtual machines. So in this case, I've already ran this script, and I already have a virtual machine named NorCalPosh inside of the cloud service named Mount Doom. So what I'm going to do is create a virtual machine called Mount Doom inside the cloud service called Mount Doom. So I just need to change a couple of variables here to make sure that I don't have any conflicts. And once I do that, I can go ahead and just hit F5 to run this script. It's going to prompt me to authenticate to type my credential for that. And what we'll see now is a bunch of verbose output on the verbose output stream in PowerShell. And it's going to go through, it's going to create a new storage account, going to create a new blob container, it's going to create the storage context, it's going to prompt us to select the image. So let me just select that here. It's going to prompt us to select the size. Actually, that's not being fed in as a variable. But now, as you can see, what it's doing is it's actually loading the Azure PowerShell module. It's calling the publish Azure VM DSC configuration command to create that zip file containing the DSC config and putting that up in blob storage. So as you can see, it says the DSC configuration has been published to mountdoom.blob.core.windows.net /norcalposh/dscconfiguration.ps1.zip. So now that the DSC configuration has been published, it's going to go ahead and configure the extension to point to it. And then finally, on line 82 here, it's actually going to instantiate that virtual machine. So let's switch over to our
Hey, Trevor,
Yep.
real quick. I know you talked about, the authentication aspect, but right there you had to log in. Can you kind of just real briefly touch on, if I'm automating this completely from the batch aspect of things?
Oh, sure.
You don't have to don't go in real detail, but just kind of describe how that would occur.
Yeah, so so in this case, we actually used the get credential command to interactively prompt us for the password to that account. But what we can do is if we want to store the password on the file system, what we can do is we can capture the credential and then call convert from secure string, I think it is.
We're looking at IE right now.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Switched over. Screen share, ISC. Okay. So let me open up a new PowerShell tab here because that other script is still running. So what I think we can do is we can call get credential. And then I think what we can do is pipe that into convert from secure string or convert to secure string.
Okay, so basically you're just going the route of saving a secure string out to a file system file and just sucking that back in.
Yeah, there's a few different commands you got to run to do that. Lee Holmes has a good article on that. So if we just go back over to IE here. Importing and exporting credentials in PowerShell. Yeah, so what we want to do is we want to call get credential to get a credential object, and then take the password, which is a secure string, convert it from a secure string, and then set it into call set content to put it into a file. And then when you actually want to read that back, you call get content from the text file and convert that back to a secure string. And that uses the data protection API in Windows to only allow the user who encrypted it to decrypt it.
Yeah, so you have to run your scheduled task or batch job as that user.
Right.
Okay, That was it. Thanks.
Cool. So, let me switch back to the portal here. So as you can see, based on the scripts that we were running, we now have a new virtual machine called Mount Doom, and it's being deployed in North Europe. And it's actually a member of the cloud service container called mountdoom.cloudapp.net. So that virtual machine is still in the process of creating, but once that's finished being created, it'll actually go ahead and install the desired state configuration extension for virtual machines, which actually installs the latest version of the Windows Management Framework core automatically. So you're going to have the latest version of PowerShell version 5 on that VM, which is pretty cool too. And it'll then extract the zip file that contains our DSC extension. It'll pass in the configuration data file, and then apply that configuration via the local configuration manager. So the DSC extension is a really cool and easy way to deploy your DSC config directly out to any new Azure VMs that you might have. So this is going to take a few minutes here, so we don't necessarily have to for it.
So Trevor, basically the extension is acting as a pull or push DSC server?
It's acting as a push.
Push, right, okay.
Yeah. So basically the local machine is, that VM is handling the entire process. So it's the VM guest agent, or the Azure guest agent, is creating an instruction to install the DSC extension. The DSC extension gets installed, the VM reboots, and then the DSC extension says, hey, I have to go download this DSC configuration from blob storage. And then, so it downloads it locally onto the file system, it extracts it, it installs any of the modules that are contained inside of that DSC zip file. And then it will actually process the DSC configuration and enforce the config.
Okay, so if I had a dedicated pull server available in Azure, I could have the extension read from that, or is it only able to read from blob storage?
So the way that this extension works is that it only reads from blob storage. However, in the one slide about Azure Automation, there is actually a new feature that allows you to use a DSC pull server in the cloud, and there's actually a new extension, there's a new VM extension that allows you to configure the Azure VM to point to that pull server. So I'm not sure if it's possible to use that same extension to point to an internal pull server as well, or if it only works with external pull servers.
But looking over the horizon, it only makes sense that those features would probably light up in the near future. Just having all these different possibilities.
Right. So you should be able to see this in the VM configuration. So if we come into the preview portal at portal.azure.com, go into optional configuration, and then extensions, and then add extension. And as you can see on the far right here, there's an Azure Automation DSC extension, and then separately, there should be a DSC, a regular DSC one as well. But yeah, this new Azure Automation DSC extension is the one that points to that cloud-based DSC pull server. So that's pretty much everything I've got. I just kind of wanted to give an overview of automating Azure and using DSC with it. And
pretty awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Real quick, have you had a chance, or is Nano available in Azure? I should ask.
It's not, unfortunately. I've talked to some other MVPs about who are trying to get it up and running in Azure, and haven't really had much success yet, but I'm hoping to do that soon.
Okay. All right. Daryl, does anybody there have questions for Trevor?
I can. I'm just trying to absorb it.
Yeah, we don't.
Okay.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you was, so with this extension, Trevor, is it pushing a MOF file out to that VM that you're deploying now?
I'm sorry, what was that?
So with the extension and the deployment that you're doing currently with the VM,
Yeah.
utilizing DSC, is that pushing a MOF file out to that local VM?
Good question. So is the DSC extension pushing out a MOF file to the VM? The answer is no, it's not. What's happening is the DSC script file that we created. So it's just a PS1 file, and then we've got the PSD1 configuration data file that feeds variables into the DSC configuration. So what's happening is the PS1 file containing the configuration document gets zipped up into an archive file along with any of the DSC modules that are required to execute that config. So what basically happens is you instantiate a new Azure virtual machine, and none of the third-party DSC resource kit modules are available on there. So what happens is this archive gets created, and all those modules get wrapped up in the archive, put up into blob storage, and then the DSC extension downloads the configuration document from blob storage, along with all those modules that are zipped up in there, right? It installs all the dependent modules into the system, and then it actually executes the configuration document like a function. So all the MOF files are actually getting generated dynamically by each Azure virtual machine that the DSC extension is deployed to.
Okay.
So in fact, I'm RDP'd right now into oh, it just died. Let me try this again. Cloud service is not present. I'm just trying to. For some reason, it's not letting me RDP into these VMs. I have to figure out what's going on exactly there. Oh, I might be in the. Am I in the wrong subscription? Oh no! You know what? That was my bad. So at the end of my script, I put some cleanup tasks, and I forgot to put a return statement before that, so it actually killed the VMs right after it provisioned them. but if you were to RDP into one of the virtual machines, if you were to RDP into one of the virtual machines, you go into there's like a packages folder at the root of the C drive, and then if you drill down far enough into the DSC extension, there's a DSC work folder, and under that DSC work folder, that's where all the MOF files are placed when the configuration gets executed. So if you do have a bug in one of the MOF files and you need to go kind of look through it and debug it, that's where you'd go to find it. And then separately, if you have any problems with the DSC extension getting installed or executed properly, if you go under the C/Windows Azure/logs and kind of drill down, there's actually a folder for the DSC extension in there where you can view the execution logs of it and just see what the status of it is.
Cool. Hey, Trevor, regarding Azure Files, I know I was actually really excited to see the fact that you could configure a centralized file share based off of Azure Files. Do you see a lot of people using that, or is that kind of like just another feature that was just nice to see come along? Or
I think it's kind of a nice to have. There hasn't really been a whole lot of activity on it lately. It came out in preview, I want to say late 2014, and it hasn't. I still don't think it's GA'd yet. So I don't really see a lot of people using that yet. I think what would probably be a little bit more useful is if there was some type of service in Azure where you could attach like an iSCSI LUN and actually share like an iSCSI LUN across multiple VMs.
Mhm.
The problem with the Azure Files feature is that even though it allows you to share files across multiple virtual machines, it's because you're attaching an SMB share, it's per session. So you're not actually attaching the share to a VM, you're attaching the share to a session and mapping a drive to it. So,
Okay.
I think it'd be more useful to have shared storage across multiple VMs at the operating system layer, at the hardware layer.
Right. Okay. Any other questions? Trevor, can you do me a favor? Just share your screen and just pop over to your YouTube channel so people can see the link and. Yeah. So, how frequently are you doing those?
Videos,
Yeah.
sporadically. I go through phases.
Okay.
I decided just kind of on a whim to do a mini series on PowerShell classes. So
Yeah, that was a good one. I just wanted to mention that as well.
cool. Let me know if you can see that.
There you go.
So if you go out to youtube.com/PCGeek86, go down to videos. I've actually got a bunch of personal videos there too that you wouldn't normally see, but yeah, so this series here, like PowerShell v5 classes, why should I use them? How do validation attributes work? How does inheritance and base classes work? Constructor methods, .NET enumerations, things like that. So
cool. Well, I found them worthwhile, so.
Well, thank you.
Keep putting them out.
That's the intent. That's what they're there for.
Great. Cool. Well, Daryl, if nobody has anything else, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. And thanks again, Trevor. I really appreciate it. I know you've been quite swamped with other speaking engagements, so.
Here.
Yeah, hey, Daryl.
So can I ask a question not related to Azure?
Sure.
So my team is in the, we do some significant work with PowerShell and doing system and application deployments. And we want to start leveraging DSC. But we're kind of struggling with how do we start to integrate that into what we're doing today. So for example, we might have a process which deploys a VM, stands, maybe it's a SQL server. It deploys a VM, stands a SQL server on top of it, displays some data, etc. Stands up a web server, configures Iaas, deploys an application on top of that. And so I see some places where DSC would fit in really nicely. Like, let's just use Iaas for example. So, installing, configuring Iaas, I think DSC, would work really well there. But then we've got some really specific stuff that would require us to write our own DSC resources, which that's okay, but I'm kind of waiting for DSC to mature a bit. So it feels like I have this, SMA style work at the beginning, some DSC work in the middle, and some like SMA style work at the end. And I'm kind of struggling with how do I get all that to work together? When that second piece of the workflow, how do I trigger that? Once I know that DSC has accomplished what I need DSC to accomplish, or should I be thinking of this in a totally different way?
You're certainly not the only person with that struggle. I'll guarantee you that. I think what you could do is if you're using SMA or Azure Automation to deploy workflows to your virtual machines, what you could potentially do is check the DSC engine's status. So that there's actually a PowerShell command called get Azure VM DSC configuration status, I think, or get Azure VM DSC extension status. And so inside of your runbook, what you could do is basically call that command against that specific virtual machine that you're deploying the runbook to
Yeah.
deploying the runbook to the VM is kind of a misnomer because you're not really executing it on the VM.
Yeah.
But you would be doing like a PowerShell remoting session or something into that VM to accomplish some task, right? So but before you actually call the PowerShell remoting session, you call the status command for the DSC extension and see, hey, what's the status? Is it in an error state? Is it completed successfully? Is it in a warning state? What is that? And then basically just put the runbook kind of into I guess you could just put it into a suspend state if the status is not successful, right?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I've been thinking we could just wait for something to become true. So if like the last thing DSC is going to do is whatever, set a particular setting on an app pool, we could wait for that setting to become whatever, true, 14, whatever the case may be. But that sounds a lot more elegant and a lot easier to scale because then I'll have to come up with some attribute to be checking across the, all the different scenarios I'd be hitting up against.
Well, one thing to keep with DSC too is that it's there's no guarantee that a particular setting will be set first or last.
Yeah,
it's all random.
But and I was thinking, well, I know that a particular app pool setting is going to be after the app pool is created.
I see.
So I'd have to end up in some scenario like that. But yeah, totally.
No, what you're describing right there is exactly what I would have recommended if I didn't know about the get Azure VM DSC extension status command. I mean, I prefer to use built-in functionality wherever possible, right? If that functionality is not available to me, then I'll implement some sort of custom mechanism. So, I mean, you're obviously on the right track, but hopefully knowing about that command will help your endeavors.
Yeah, that sounds much more elegant.
Hey, Steven, in that use case, are you seeing that initially like on the builds of your web servers or the ongoing life cycle of the web server?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I was trying to make a joke.
All right. Are you seeing that use case mostly in your initial builds and deployments of like your web servers or the ongoing life cycle?
So today we're 100% focused on an initial push, an initial setup. With DSC, we want to get to a world of, we want long-term configuration management. But I need some type of transition to get to a place where I really want to get to is, some SMA-style workflow gets, the VMs for an environment stood up, and then DSC comes along and takes it from there, all the way to my company's custom web services deployed on that box.
Right. The reason I ask is what I'm seeing on my side of the house and my company is, we're doing a heavy push on automating the deployment of our development processes. So, I've been heavily keeping an eye on this space and the config management piece of just building out the infrastructure. But now I'm starting to see the development side of the house starting to meet in the middle, saying, hey, I'm continually deploying my app, following continuous integration and deployment. How do I marry that up with tools like Chef, Puppet, or Ansible to integrate with, that handoff with DSC? What should I do here as opposed to there? And it's interesting. I don't think it's fully clarified yet.
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky, and my team owns the whole process. So lucky, cursed, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So I mean, I would look at whatever tools you're using for like your code deployment, because that's going to be changing like your settings and parameters, right? If you're going to be changing the app pool, it's probably an app setting change that might be derived from some enhancement you're doing in your web app.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
Nick pinged me a few minutes ago. He was wanting to join the conversation, but I think he's watching it from the YouTube channel.
I don't see anybody else on.
Nobody's on.
There's 2 viewers. I think there are a couple people watching.
Oh, I guess they don't show up on the Google Hangout then?
No, no.
Is there a way for them to engage, or no?
I'd have to send him the link. He can just ask his question over Twitter. We could try that.
I
Yeah,
just put it on FaceTime and then hold them up to the screen.
You could do that, yeah.
Let me see if he's got any questions.
just tweet with the. Tell him to tweet with the PowerShell hashtag or something.
So anybody else got anything? No.
All right. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks again, Trevor.
Thank you for having me, Eric and Daryl.
Yeah, look.
Really
no
appreciate
problem.
it.
No problem. Hopefully we can get you out to the Bay here sometime soon.
That'd be awesome. I love San Fran.
So yeah, if you ever make it out here, let us know. We'll have you on site at the Microsoft office. So
Good deal.
cool. All right, gang. Appreciate it much. Take care.
Have a good night.
Yeah.
Cheers.
See you.